Good afternoon. My name is Andrew Patner. I'm going to tell you a few secrets about Studs. He was not born in Chicago. He lived his first 10 or so years in New York City, but fortunately for us, he put that behind him. He did attend both the college and the law school, graduated from both of them, unlike me. Studs commuted from the near North Side, where he lived and worked with his folks who had a residential hotel, an apartment hotel at Grand and Wells. And I think there's an interesting story as well that we'll get to as we talk about that. I think it would be fair to say that through his decades-long career as an actor, a writer, a radio host, a disc jockey, an activist, a mentor, Studs has had a, what would be the right word, Studs? Complex relationship with the University of Chicago?
Mixed.
But we're going to go into both the positive and the negative side. But there were some key things that did happen for Studs here, one of which was your name. You're not Louis Terkel to most
Studs.
people.
I wish it were what you think it was, but it wasn't. Studs. It came about because of Studs Lonigan. This happens to be the 100th anniversary, by the way, of the birth of James T. Farrell. And James T. Farrell wrote of this kid on the south side of Chicago, a trilogy, very powerful, that's now been come out as a Library of the America. Very few American writers have had their books anthologized. His has. I love that book, Studs Lonigan. It was 1935, the Great Depression. My name was Louis, but I was in a play called Waiting for Lefty. It was an old labor theater play. I did that to avoid the law. I'll come to that in a moment. Now, I went to law school dreaming of Clarence Darrow, woke up to Antonin Scalia. You know. He, by the way, who taught here after I'd left. Well, since you're subject of law, first of all, I'm delighted to be here and deeply moved because this brings back all sorts of memories. And Andrew mentioned I was in the class of 32 for the baccalaureate. The young chancellor was Robert Maynard Hutchins, who was sort of an elitist, but he was the great advocate of academic freedom. He believed anybody, remember in the time of Joe McCarthy, he held forth. He was destroyed, but he held forth. He said, anybody can teach, even a communist can teach too, he said, provided he knows his subject and does not try to inculcate the students with his own ideology. That's the kind of guy he was. Way back at the turn of the century when this university was formed, Thorstein Veblen taught economics, the man who conceived the idea of conspicuous waste, conspicuous consumption. If ever a guy is contemporary, it's Veblen. And of course, a guy who followed me by a year at the law school was Harry Calvin, who became perhaps the most eloquent advocate of the First Amendment ever. The school also had as an alumnus John Ashcroft. Now it so happens, I feel at this moment guilt of association. That was a phrase very popular days when tail gunner Joe McCarthy riding high and our most sainted director of the FBI was John Edgar Hoover. The phrase was guilt by association that made you something of a fellow traveler. Today, my guilt of association is I'm a fellow alumnus of John Ashcroft. Now, the fact is he was in the class of 1967 law school. I got my law degree in 1934. He should be older than I am, but he's not. He should be younger than I am, but he's much older than I am. I figured out that John Ashcroft is 305 years old. You know why? You all saw him in a previous incarnation in Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible. Now, you remember The Crucible. Crucible dealt with terrorists of the time, witches. Salem, Massachusetts. Remember the play? Just to recreate it, the plot. Salem, Massachusetts, late 1600s, and this fear of witches, terrorists of the day. And so along comes this evangelist. His name is Reverend Paris, but it's really Brother Joe Ashcroft, you see. And he points his accusatory finger at those young hysterical girls. There's hysteria in the town, of course. Name names. Name those who are consorting with the devil. If you're not with me, you're against God and me. Or the order of importance of me and God, I suppose. But he named, and as a result of which a couple of old women were hanged. And that, I maintain, is when the USA Patriot Act was first drafted. So you see, the university has a mixed, it's open to anybody, you see. So it brought forth a Thorstein Veblen, a Maynard Hutchins, as well as Ashcroft. And so I like that idea very much.
A very, very fine judge of the D.C. Circuit Federal Court of Appeals, David Tatel, a longtime civil rights advocate. And I asked him once, did you know Ashcroft in your class? He said, nobody knew him. I said, well, do you remember him? He says, everybody remembers him. I said, can you put those two together? He said, well, think about it. This is 1964 to 1967. There was one student who wore a suit and tie to class every day. His name was John Ashcroft. So,
see, as he brings forth the name of John Ashcroft, the same class as Bernardine Dorn. You may remember Bernardine Dorn, by the way, who's doing remarkably wonderful work today. She played a role in the pardoning and the finding innocent many of those on death row, some of her students at Northwestern. But Bernardine was known for her shapely legs at the time. So imagine John Ashcroft, pious, puritanical John Ashcroft, concentrating on a course called partnership, or whatever it is, and he sees her legs. Imagine what that was doing to him. That could be the basis of a play. It was. Somerset Maugham once wrote a play called Rain, of Sadie Thompson. It was a movie with Joan Crawford as a loose woman in a town of Pango, somewhere in the South Seas, and this preacher named Reverend Davidson, played by Walter Houston. And he went crazy. He wanted to save her, but of course he went crazy, you know. And so I was thinking of John Ashcroft observing the legs of Bernardine Dorn, one in law class. So law school, you work in Chicago, you see, has all sorts of possibilities.
now, Studs, I think that you've talked in the past about how you did fail at one thing about law school. Another thing we should clear up. People say, oh, Studs went to law school, he didn't graduate, he didn't take the bar, didn't pass. He passed the bar.
Now, wait a minute, I flunked the first
The first
bar.
time.
The bar, you must understand, I told you I went to Dreaming Clarence Darrow. I was raised in a hotel, mostly that Andrew talked about, that my father ran and my mother did. It was a men's hotel near North Side, and it was full of argument and debate. See, back then, working men, believe it or not, a lot of them used to read little books called Blue Books. Came out of Girard, Kansas. They'd read, and they'd argue, and they'd debate, and they'd discuss. They wouldn't be sitting by supinely as couch potatoes, but they'd argue. There were guys who were pro-union, guys who were pro-company, and the old Wobblies, you know, Wobblies were IWW guys that called Wobblies, called these guys scissor bills, capitalists with holes in their pockets, you know, because they were supporting the big boys. But they had arguments, so I loved the arguments. So that led to my getting into trouble now and then during the McCarthy days. I was a disc jockey, and then TV was brand new, and I was one of the 3 programs in Chicago that came out of Chicago. In those days, 1950 I'm talking about, which is 54 years ago. TV was like movies of 1915 were. And there were 3 programs. One was called Garraway at Large. Dave Garraway, a fellow disc jockey of mine, went to New York and became the most famous face in the world for a time. He was the one who was the first host of a revolutionary program called Today, the Today Show, because there was no TV in the daytime. The other was Bert Tilstrom, who was the genius of our group, who had puppets called Kukla, Fred, and Ollie. And the little puppets came to life, and they were wonderful. There was a program I was involved with, Studs Place. It was a little restaurant, and my 3 colleagues who were gifted and I. There was no written script. There was a plot, but we improvised. And so it's full of improvisation. All 3 programs were. So the preeminent critic in New York called it TV Chicago style. So now I was hot. A young announcer from Chicago named Mike Wallace went to New York. John Chancellor went to New York. Hugh Downs, and I was being courted until the Cold War and Joe McCarthy caught up with me. I signed all sorts of petitions. In fact, I never met a petition I didn't like. And the petitions were anti-poll tax, anti-lynching, anti-fascist refugee committee. And so in comes an emissary from New York and says, well, this show Stud Place is still hot, and I'm being courted by New York agents. He says, we're in big trouble. I thought, where do you get that wee stuff, you know? You know, Tonto and the Lone Ranger, you know that story. And so he says, your name is on all these petitions. I says, yeah, I guess it is. He says, don't you know that communists were behind those petitions? And that's when I get a tendency to get cute. I said, suppose communists come out against cancer. Do we have to come out for cancer? And he said, that is not very funny. And then he said, these days you got to stand up and be counted. So I stood up like that. He said, that's not funny either. You know? And then finally he said, why don't you just say you were duped, you were a fool, you were an idiot, you were taken by the commies? I said, I can't do that because the petitions are okay. I can't. To this day, people say it. Andrew is one of the things. Stud, you were heroic. Heroic, I will, if you'll give the expression, I was scared shitless. But my ego was at stake, and that's what it was all about. Some people use euphemism, self-esteem. My vanity, ego, so that's what it's all about. But there's a wonderful epilogue to all this. In the meantime, while I was trying to make a buck or two, I was blacklisted. I would lecture for women's clubs on jazz and folk music because I had been a jazz disc jockey before that. And they'd received letters of warning from a man in Chicago, a Legionnaire, who declared himself Joe McCarthy's man. He was the Americanism Committee of One. He'd write them warning letters about me, and not one of them ever canceled. But this one elegant old lady, very Brahmin and aristocratic, who was chair of one of the clubs, was so furious at the letter, she says, Mr. Terkel, your fee was $100, we will double it to $200. And so what could I do? I sent this man, the Joe McCarthy man, a check for $10. And I included a letter saying, this is your agent's fee for getting the extra $100. And you know what? He never acknowledged my check. But here's the payoff. While I was a disc jockey, I played all sorts of records. I was eclectic, you know. Be an opera, it might have been Caruso doing Celeste Aida, and then go to Louis Armstrong, West End Blues, then to Woody Guthrie, Dust Bowl Ballad. I played a singer named Mahalia Jackson a lot. No one heard of her. And I played Mahalia because I heard her record, Move On Up, and we became friends. And so now time has passed. I'm still blacklisted. Mahalia is now internationally known. And now CBS, Columbia, offers her a radio network program. And she's still doing a condition that Studs is the host and MC. They were very reluctant, but they agreed. So we're doing this program. It has a live audience Friday nights. It's on the network. Wrigley Building. And about 400 people come in. About 6:30, the audience comes in. The program goes on at 7. Well, about the third week of the program, it's scheduled for 13 weeks. Third week, another man comes in from New York, this time CBS. And he, on stage while we were rehearsing, and it was a very easy rehearsal, Mahalia and I would just ad-lib and go into her songs. Where'll I take a swig of this? Very dramatic. And so this guy comes to me on stage and hands me a piece of paper, and he's very polite. This is pro forma. You just sign it. I look at it. It's a loyalty oath. Are you, have you been, all that stuff? I said, I don't believe in that stuff. I don't sign that. He said, but you must. Now, voices are raised, and Mahalia's passing by to rehearse with the pianist. She hears the... Now, she knew all about me. She said, Stud, you got such a big mouth, you should have been a preacher. So she says, is that what I think it is, baby? I says, yeah. Are you going to sign it? I says, of course not. Okay, let's rehearse. And he says very diffidently, but Miss Jackson, Mr. Terkel has to sign this, came from headquarters. And then all she says is, you tell Mr. So-and-so, the fire Studs find nothing Mahalia Jackson. You know what happened? Nothing. He disappeared. We did the program on schedule, it finished. What does that prove? It proves that Mahalia had more guts and more spine than General Sarnoff and William Paley at CBS, and all of them put together. The answer is saying no to the official word. It applies now more than ever. I think it's wrong. So basically, that's what it's all about.
I want to go to a prologue, though, for that story.
Sorry?
I say I want to go to a prologue to that story. The one thing that I think you did perhaps fail at in law school was everybody hopes to spend 3 years never being called on. And you were called on, I think, once. Yeah. You had it figured. You knew how to hide behind a taller student.
Forgot to mention
but there's a
that.
Professor Sheldon Teft who finally calls on you once.
Professor Sheldon Teft
was
a basso profundo voice, very deep. He caught me once and called. I never did. It was a court in equity. It was something about a spike fence, and I didn't like it. I didn't know what it's about. I faked. And so I got up, and I said, no court of equity, there's a court of iniquity. And he said, that's not very funny. 0, of course. The only time, well, the fact is, you say I passed the bar. I flunked the first bar, 80% passed. I was one of the 20. Back in those days, they had quiz courses. Evans, Baker, preparing for a bar exam, you take these quiz courses. My mind wasn't on it, and so I flunked. But the second bar, in November, the first was in June, I passed. Those were essay questions. You could say yes, but on the other hand, no. Well, I'm good at that, you know. Because basically it's faking, and that's my forte, faking. So I passed that bar. But however, my mind wasn't on it. I'm sure. Do you hear a whistle? That's my hearing aid whistling. I'm a slave to technology. And it's it. Okay, it stopped now. Well, the fact is, I didn't want to practice, so I never did. So I got a job, civil service job, then I got into acting by accident. I became a gangster, a Chicago gangster, in all the radio soap operas. Chicago, more soap operas than the New York and the Coast put together. So I was in Bob Perkins and John's Other Wife. Not A Woman in White was about a nurse. Guiding Light about they all were the same scripts. They were the same. And they had the same 3 gangsters, Chicago gangsters. The bright one, the middle one, the dumb one. I was always the dumb one. And so that's how I broke in as an actor.
Studs,
One thing led to another, and here I am, for better or for worse.
You're talking about that reminds me, one of your co-stars had a son-in-law who went on to some fame or infamy.
Oh, well, no, mother-in-law.
Yeah, right. She had a son-in-law.
I was in Betty and Bob. Betty and Bob was again a gangster, and I was threatening the mother of Betty, played by an actress named, what was it, Davis. Edie Davis was her name. Edie Davis was an elegant actress. We used a lot of profanity, very elegant, married to a very famous surgeon in town, Loyal Davis. She had a daughter named Nancy Davis. And so here I am threatening Edie, and one day I pick up the news, and there's President Ronald Reagan and his wife Nancy and his mother-in-law Edie Davis. And that's when I had the revelation, it's hard to tell where soap opera leaves off and life begins.
Another benefit that you did gain from law school, or maybe the benefit you gained, as I recall, is you took trolleys. You took trolleys from the near north side to Hyde Park.
Oh,
and that
my
meant that you went through
discovery,
Bronzeville.
yeah. Well, you know, what have I got to thank the UC for? Many professors I did have in sociology, Harold Lastwell and Fred Schumann in national relations. But as far as the law school is concerned, by the way, there were some good teachers. I pointed out one, basso profundo, basso buffo, really, you know. But the others were good teachers. But what was I saying?
Bronzeville.
Huh?
Bronzeville, the law school, the trolleys.
Oh, so I lived in the Wells Grand Hotel, and I was a streetcar student. So I had to transfer. And I stopped off the trance in Bronzeville, the black community, and it was very much alive then. I heard this music, and there were race records, there were blues, Big Bill Brunsey, and coming out of the stores, and Memphis Minnie and Tampa Red, and these are urban country blues played in the city. I should buy those records, and that's how I became a blues fan and a friend of that. So I thank the University of Chicago Law School for leading me to the blues.
You talked about getting into acting by accident. What do you mean you got into it by accident?
The what?
Acting. You got into it, you said, by accident. How do you mean you got into it by accident?
Well, I don't know. While I was on a project, it was WPA. You know, we're suffering right now, the country, what I call a national Alzheimer's disease. There is no memory of yesterday. Something happened. There was a Great Depression in the 30s. What's going to happen? Along comes the New Deal of Franklin D. Roosevelt and Henry Wallace and Harold Ickes. And here come these men and Harry Hopkins. Here comes the government that helped save our new religion, the free market, which fell on its fanny. It fell on it. What can we do? I once interviewed for the book that some of you may have read or will buy, the book called Hard Times, which of course is a steal of Dickens' title. But it's about the Great Depression. So I'm interviewing a guy, this is years later, this deals with maybe a national Alzheimer's disease. And this guy is the Greenspan of his time. He's senior partner at Goldman Sachs. And I said to him, what happened when that crash occurred, the crash of 1929, when bam, came the Great Depression in the 30s? He said, I don't know. And I thought, if you don't know, who does, And then he went on to say, that day the ticker tape was going all night, and J.P. Morgan and John D. Jr. buying thousands of shares of common stock, and down they went. Guys are jumping out of windows. And then he said, we waited for some kind of an announcement. I thought, announcement from whom? From God? The announcement came from the federal government, regulation, SEC, Security Exchange Commission, all the alphabet. So their butts were saved by the federal government. And then you got their sons and grandsons and granddaughters saying, too much big government. They don't even know or don't care what happened, except they're against all these except military, of course. Spend all you want for the military, but not for health education. That's what I mean by national Alzheimer's disease. So naturally it calls for the government to step in today, too, more. Not in the sense of W, but in the sense of, say, FDR or something like that. So that's all part of it.
I'm
what
thinking
we
of... I'm
so
thinking,
how I
it's
got
all
to
right.
be... You don't mind I ramble, but hopefully, thanks to Andrew, we come back to the point. And so I got a job on the WPA. Before I was on the Writers' Project, another one, and I met this guy who was having a theater group. It's called the Chicago Repertory Group. They were doing plays back in those then, protest plays. And the favorite playwright was Clifford Odets, that was his name. And the play was called Waiting for Lefty. It's about a taxi cab driver's strike. And anyway, because I lived in that hotel I told you about, I'd go to see plays and movies when I was a kid because the press agent knows that we would put up a sign in your lobby plugging the play, and I got 2 free tickets. So I was 13 when I became a playgoer because the hotel was only a couple of blocks away from the theater section. Press agent put up and they'd give me 2 tickets. The guys lived in my hotel, didn't care about plays, but I got so that's how I became and I got in a conversation with this guy. He's come down to see this group, and this guy is sick one day. He said, get up there, read a line. I did, and he said, I got the part. From then on, I became that and made $1 or $2 in soap operas. One thing led to another. I became a disc jockey, then a commentator, and bit by bit, TV came along. And finally, I got bounced. And finally, a guy came along and wanted certain books. While I was doing, I met a new radio station called WFMT. How many of you know of that station? Those of you who live in Chicago do. It was just beginning. And I latched onto that station when I was blacklisted. And I went on, and the owner of the station, Bernie, said, do anything you want. You got an hour a day, anything. And so I began to interview people by accident. And that's how it came about that I interviewed people. And one day a publisher from New York says, how about starting a book about that? And good time. That's how it all happened. It's all, my life is what I call an accretion of accidents.
But good accidents,
That's about it.
fortunately. I want to ask you a couple other things about the 1930s.
Yeah.
You mentioned some names perhaps known to many here, Robert Maynard Hutchins, who not only, of course, stood up to McCarthy, but to Springfield, to the investigations that were going on long before McCarthy here in Illinois on academic freedom. Harry Calvin Jr., but a name that might not be as well remembered, and an incident that happened actually after you graduated. I'm thinking of Robert Morse Lovett.
Oh, well, this
Public
is a
steel
wonderful story.
strike.
This is a story about Hutchins. Hutchins had an aide named Milton Mayer. Milton Mayer became a very eloquent Quaker, and he was the aide to Hutchins. He wrote a biography, Robert Maynard Hutchins, and he asked if I would do the introduction. I read the book, and I said, I got to do the introduction to it. And so in that, something I experienced, too. Hutchins, this is 1937, and the labor battles are going on. The CIO is being organized, and the steel workers and the packing all being organized. And there was one guy, and the big steel companies finally agreed with the union. They agreed, they recognized the union. That's Bethlehem Steel and U.S. Steel. But there's one company in Chicago, Republic Steel. Tom says, I will not recognize the union. And so there was a strike. And there was a picnic on Memorial Day in 1937. Strikers and their wives and kids are on the grounds of Republic Steel in South Chicago. And there's chicken and potato salad. Someone threw a stone, and cops were there at the behest of Girdler, and they shot down 10 people, killed them in the back. There was a huge protest meeting at the Civic Opera House that I attended. I'm way back in the balcony. And the chairman was an old, beloved professor, named Robert Morse Lovett, who taught literature. And he was beloved, but he also was a very fervent and passionate man of perhaps a socialist, but he was very passionate. He was the MC, and he was fervent. That had Carl Sandburg speaking there, and A. Philip Randolph speaking there, and as well as Len Dupre, a fellow alumnus of ours who was wonderful. And this guy, Lovett is wonderful. The next day, young Robert Maynard Hutchins, who's only been the president of the university, the chancellor for a couple of years, gets a call from a member of the board of directors, board of trustees. You got to fire Robert Morse Lovett, because we're going to lose all sorts of contributions of people who are sympathetic to the owner of Republic Steel. And just then, another old professor appears at the doorway of the young Chancellor Hutchins, who's in his 30s. And this man's name was James Weber Lynn. He was also beloved and well-known. And he said to the young chancellor, if you fire Bob Lovett, you'll have the resignation of 20 tenured college professors on your desk in half an hour. Hutchins said, no, I won't. My successor will. And I think that's a wonderful story about Hutchins. No, I won't. My successor will, because he wouldn't. So that's the kind of stuff that this university, and by the way, I'm not putting it down. We have a very excellent man as president, by the way. Randall is a musicologist and a very enlightened guy, and there are wonderful teachers here, too. And there's also the Department of Economics, head of Milton Friedman. That's something else. Then you got all the advice, you see your advisor, George W. You know about that, of course. You know, Wolfowitz came here, Pearl, too. So, as you can see, it's very ecumenical.
Another great thing about the University of Chicago that I can think of in your life, Studs, though I'm not sure that you met while you were students, but when you were acting, you met another holder of the PhB, 1933, a young lady named Ida Goldberg from Wisconsin.
Yeah, she came from Wisconsin, Ashland, Wisconsin. She was a social worker. You know, the school is known for its SSA. And she was part of that one of the early days when teachers were Grace and Edith Abbott. Sophonisba Breckenridge, isn't that a great name? Sophonisba Breckenridge was dean of that school, who, by the way, was the first woman law student at the University of Chicago. The old law school was an old building, and they had the names of, you see, Roscoe Pound, and you see Sophonisba Breckenridge. That's down there where we used to shoot crap and play cards. We're going to get some of their questions soon, too.
Oh, just wanted you to finish about Ida, that she studied in the social work school, and then you all met through acting? Or?
We met her. I never met her at the university. We were attending at the same time. She came to this she'd come as an actress. She was curious, this acting company, and we met, and that was pretty much the ticket. She was quite committed to things. She was very gentle, and as you know her, she was pretty attractive and gentle. But also, she was a scrapper, you know. And she was arrested a number of times in anti-war Vietnam protests. You know who Gary Wills is? Gary Wills, the historian. So once when he came to the house for the first time, she'd welcome the door. She says, "Oh, you and I were arrested together, weren't we?" Well, she tells one story. I use her name sometimes. In a couple of books, changed her name. When she was a young social worker, and this probably tells everything about humiliation, being on relief. In those days, it's called welfare today. In the British called it the dole, being on relief. And there's one guy, when I was on the Writers Project, that was something else too. This man, I won't mention his name. He's gone now anyway. He was the editor of a paper doing well in Middle Ohio. And he came to Chicago, worked on one of the big papers, and then got laid off, as many did. Couldn't find a job no matter how he tried. He sent his wife and kids back to Ohio, and he had to go on relief. And so this caseworker, I'm giving you the case, this is the opposite of my wife. This man is telling me, this guy Jim is telling me the story. So he says, the humiliation involved. He says, how do you live? Well, I'm staying with a friend. What kind of friend? Well, tell me about the friend. What kind of friend? He said, what do you mean, what kind of friend? A friend. And then he said to him, he almost burst out crying with fury, the indignation, the humiliation. And then my wife, that was one kind of social worker. Then there was another kind. My wife was told by the supervisor at a certain moment, you've got to go to your client, the person, and you got to look in that client's closet. And she said, I can't do that. Look at his closet, or her closet. Well, you got to do it, else it's your job. So she says, and then she describes the story. Oh, this is about me and my work. See, I was looking for somebody like her, and she gave me names of friends of hers. Then it occurred to me, like her, she's the one who told me the story I'm about to tell you. I said, I got to use her in a book. Change her name, because she insisted on that. And she says, I was told I got to go look at his closet. So I appeared to this man. I remember, and now I got the microphone. We're on the home at the couch. Remember that. All I want, I want her thoughts in this book. In the meantime, she's getting rather emotional. That doesn't matter to me. I want her name, and I want to get her story in this book to counter the other story about the other one. And she says, and so I saw my patient, an elderly person, he worked in railroads. I remember him, and now she's starting to get emotional. He had gray hair, and lived with his little granddaughter. And the place was absolutely bare, very proud man. And then I said to him, and now she's getting more emotional. And I hope you'll forgive me, but I'm supposed to look into your closet. He says, my closet? Well, of course, go ahead. She looked, and it was empty, of course. And he was so humiliated. And I was too. And that's when she's suppressing a sob. And I'm saying, this is great. You know, and then she's, you bastard. Well, so you figure, in other words, I gotta get what I gotta get, no matter what. That's what it was. So she happened to be my wife, but I can't help that. She was the right one for that. So that's what you're talking
Right.
about. Yeah.
And Studs and Ida for 60-some years were just a wonderful team. And actually, after Ida's death, when Studs wasn't sure what he was going to do, how he was going to continue, that inspired not your last book, because you seem to turn out a book every 6 months or so these days, but the book before that, May the Circle Be Unbroken. And then that led to Hope Dies Last. Maybe we could talk a little bit about Hope Dies Last,
Well,
and then we can open it up to
Last
questions.
It's about life, really. It's called, what do I call it? Will the Circle Be Unbroken? You know that song, John Cash and the Carter family. It's a hymn known to whites and blacks, Will the Circle Be Unbroken? And it's reflections on life and death, but it isn't. It's really a tribute to life. The whole premise of the book is that death itself is just a reflection of life that has no meaning unless there's something you lived on earth. So basically it's a tribute to life is what it is. And so that.
And out of that came, you met
Out
some
of
people
that
in
came
Hope
the book
Dies
called
Last.
Hope Dies Last. This is about the people I call the prophetic minority. These are the protesters down through the years. And, you know, Thomas Paine and Sam Adams were a minority. When you go to think about the American Revolution, we say, we fought against. What do you mean by we fought against the British? Half America was Tory. They didn't care what the government, as long as they made a buck or two. It was the agitators who did. And Tom Paine, one of the most eloquent. Then there were the abolitionists. See, I hate that phrase, the greatest generation, about the one of which I was part, the Tom Brokaw. It's a phony phrase. The greatest generation is by its very nature a put-down of the 60s, quite frankly. Is it greater than the 60s? I believe they're a great generation. No, great. The 60s, out of the World War II, the feminist movement did not come. Out of World War II, the civil rights movement did not come. Any black soldier World War II can tell you about that. But the attack on homophobia, the challenge to it, did not come. It came as a result of the 60s. That's just as great a generation. So what we're talking about.
That's good enough.
And so I'm paying tribute to these people who were attacked, whether they, Cliff Virginia Durd, whom I tracked it, I don't want to go into that too long. There were a couple who worked in the New Deal, came out of Montgomery, Alabama, a white couple, and they were premature integrationists, you'd say. And they fought and fought. There were a few of them. One day, 1965, some of Montgomery March, 200,000 people show up, when it only to be 17, 20 people walking down the streets to be eggs and tomatoes. It's remarkable. So it's always been that. And so I got people who were dissenters in it. Maybe end with one. As a little, she's 85 pounds. Her name is Kathy Kelly. And she's the epilogue to the book. Kathy Kelly is a disciple of Dorothy Day. You ever heard Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker? And Kathy Kelly came from working class, middle class Irish family. She taught at a good school named St. Ignatius, a very wonderful school. And then somehow she found out, this is what it's all about. And she became a protester. And she finds herself in Basra and in Baghdad bearing witness. But the story she tells, and we'll end with this is perfect. It fits today, it fits Iraq, it fits everything. Kathy wanted to go to a missile site. Now, I know you've all seen missile sites and may not know it. When you drive down highways, especially in Missouri, which is most of them, it's a little hill, and there's a white stick. That's a missile site. It looks like nothing, but within it is enough to knock off 100,000 people at a crack. And there's scores of them, hundreds, but in Mississippi, in Missouri especially. So she decides to protest the missile site. So she and a couple of young other Catholic kids cut through, and she's the only one on this missile site. And by the way, the missile site is you can't plant corn, and this is corn country. So first of all, she plants seeds of corn. Then she mounts the missile site and has the sign, study war no more, beat your swords into plowshares, Isaiah, Old Testament prophet. And she calls up the authorities. She tells them she's here. She wants it advertised. And so here she sits, all 85 pounds of her, on this little missile site, and here come the big trucks, military, and the bullhorn. The guy with the bullhorn, the brigadier general colonel, says, will the personnel on that truck dismount with your hands raised? And so she, the personnel, dismounts, and then they kneel. She kneels, and they handcuff her. Now here comes a soldier boy at her, with his gun pointing at her. He's trembling. He's afraid of her. She's a terrorist, 85 pounds of her. And he's trembling. He's got the gun to her head. And she says to him, do you know why I'm kneeling? You know what I'm doing? He said, why, ma'am? He's a country boy. And she says, I'm praying for the corn to grow. Don't you want the corn to grow? And this kid says, yes, ma'am. He says, will you pray with me for the corn to grow? And he's a religious kid, and he kneels and he prays with her for the corn to grow. And then while they're praying, he says to her, ma'am, it's very hot. Are you thirsty? She says, oh, yes. And he puts down his gun, which is, of course, a violation. And the other kids don't know what the hell to do. They're running around. And he said, will you put your head back a little? And he pours the water down her throat. And then she's arrested. And he goes back to his truck. And then she comes to the courtroom. She sees him, and he's trembling. He's afraid that she's not going to show. She winks at him. And then she says in the book, I hope if he happens to read this book, this boy, he'll forgive me for telling you this story. Well, as it is, she got herself a year. Oh, the magistrate says she get nothing if she recants, and she wouldn't. Anyway, so that's the Kathy Kellys. Now, who is this kid? This kid's in Iraq. He wants to be home planting corn instead of doing what he's doing. So that's what the book's about, in a way. Chicago had, maybe still has, a great sociology department that was quite remarkable. Louis Wirth, of course. Are you a sociologist? Yeah. Well, did you go here? No. Oh, well, UC had a great school. Saul Alinsky, the famous organizer, who got the idea of community organizing, was a product of Robert E. Park, who was a great sociologist here.
Interesting, too, a couple of these names, Robert Ezra Park, his grandson, longtime member of the faculty here, Jamie Redfield.
Jamie Redfield was a great anthropologist.
And that was his father, Redfield. Robert Redfield, right? Yeah.
I remember I was in a class, this is my undergraduate years. So I went to 2 years to a junior college in Chicago, Crane Junior. And then 1 year, the 7 years and 6, your first year of law school counted for the fourth year for a baccalaureate. So I got the bachelor's in 32 and the law degree in 34. And so the anthropology department, Fay Cooper Cole, he was a Brit. He was very good.
And Lovett's grandson also, Robert Lovett Ashenhurst.
And this is a wistful memory, how I happened to miss the 1929 first game of the Cubs Athletics World Series. I could have seen that. But there was a course here, I forgot if Fay Cooper Cole or someone, in Gestalt psychology. And my friend Jimmy O'Hare says, let's go to see the Cubs' first game, play of the Athletics. This is 1929 World. We can get in, standing room at Wrigley Field. And I say, I can't. I want to go hear this thing on Gestalt psychology. And it was about Sultan. It's a famous case. You've heard of Sultan the gorilla. There were two guys named Kaler and Kafka, two Gestalt. And there's this gorilla, and there's the bananas, and you can't reach them, but there's a stick, and he connects the two. The stick, he picks it up, he smacks the banana, comes down. So that's what I learned. So I got learning about Gestalt, but I missed the fantastic game. And the game in which, well, I don't know if you follow baseball or not. The manager of the Athletics, Connie Mack, fooled the Cubs. Cubs had a great murderer's row, Rogers, Hornsby, and Kyler, and Hack Wilson. They wanted the fastball of Lefty Grove. Instead, the guy brings in an old guy didn't pitch a game all his life. The ball went 20 miles an hour, and they broke their back striking out, and they won the game. That's the game I missed. to learn about Sultan the Gorilla. By the way, Andrew is the perfect guy to interview me because he used to hear me from his childhood on. When did you first hear me?
I first, the tables are turned. I would have first heard you in my mother's womb, probably, Studs. But I first can recollect hearing you in the early 1960s.
Yeah.
And an annual ritual for my family, my brothers and I, was to listen to This Train, which was your program on the 1963 March on Washington.
You see, I had good luck to be on this radio station, in which it just happened. The station came into being as I joined at the same time. And never, it's the greatest classical music station in the world. I mean, in the world would play the. But the owner, Bernie Jacobs, said to me, "It's your hour." It's a dream suggestion. So I used to read short stories of Flannery O'Connor or John Cheever or Ring Lardner or Chekhov and do documentaries. He'd talk of a documentary. Sometimes I went on the train to Washington, 1963 March, led by King. Talked to people on the train, and that became a documentary. Or some kids I heard, a social worker says, these kids are having a fight over a swimming pool in a mixed neighborhood. Greek kids, Italian kids, black kids, and Hispanic kids. And I talked to them. And one of the questions, what would you do if you were God? What would you do if you were God? And the responses were fantastic. One guy says, I don't want the job. Who wants that job? You mean I got to make... And the other one is, a little Puerto Rican kid says, well, you know, what did Christ look like to you? What do you think Christ... Well, he looked like me. I think that everybody wants somebody he revered, whatever word you use, respects, to be like himself. See, if I were Russian or Japanese, I think he's yellow, something like that. If I were a black kid, I think he's black, you know. If I were a Italian kid, he's Italian. I'm Puerto Rican. I think God's Puerto Rican. It's that sort of stuff I would do. Aside from, and that led to the books. That led to...
It's an important thing, too, I think, for people who don't live in or didn't recently live in Chicago to know that there really are these two sets of things going on at the same time with Studs. The books which grow out of these interviews, but also the show kept going. And the show, those tapes, and the book tapes are not necessarily the same thing. This is a triple, quadruple career. But they're all archived now at CHS.
Yeah, there are two aspects to my career. Because the book I'm working on now, well, if I finish it, is called about the musical artists I've had. The others, most of the people are the non-celebrated, the so-called ordinary people, a phrase I dislike because ordinary makes it seem patronizing. But the people who are capable of extraordinary things, the non-celebrated. Now I'm choosing artists I liked through the years in the world of music, opera singers and jazz and folk.
And there's already a book out from the theater people and film people,
that's based on the tapes I have at the Chicago Historical Society.
And you can go, there's a website either through the Historical Society. There's even, I just learned today, Studs, I never knew. Did you know that you have a website?
I don't even know what a website is. I'm just learning.
I didn't set him up, but I thought I'd get a good answer.
I do not recognize the 21st century.
But there is a website, studsterkel.org.
I'm learning to use right now. It's a fantastic adventure. The electric typewriter.
You mentioned the generation of the 40s and of the 60s, and I think we skipped over the good side of the 50s, the civil rights movement, of course, in the 50s. But this gentleman would like to know any perspective on the current generation, the
Well, that's a good question. That's one that comes up a lot. I think it's both. There are the kids of the sports grills, the NASCAR kids. At the same time, there's a new group. Even the punk, you'll find something going on among the punk rock singers, among the punk artists, so-called. A wholly new rebellious thing that's healthy. There's some junk, too. It's both. It's mixed. But I feel a sort of hope, strangely enough. Now, the thing about the young is that many had turned off. The last election, 2000, where Bush beat Gore. You know how many people voted from the ages of 25? 18 and 25, 14%. 86%, no, 16% voted. 84% stayed home. And that's what did it. It wasn't Nader. It wasn't the corrupt Florida things, both of which have a point. It was the fact that the young. This time, there's going to be a big younger vote. I'm convinced of it. I wish Kerry had a little more juice to him, but I think there'll be a much bigger. But there is something going on.
In terms of the
it's one of those. Remember what they're being fed daily, the trivia, day after day after day. There's a phrase Hannah Arendt used about fascism, Eichmann in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt spoke of the banality of evil, that there was something banal about it. Well, I like to reverse that, the evil of banality. And it's the evil of banality, the trivia that's being emphasized. The young are fed more and more. But despite that, I have this feeling.
I think Michael Benke or somebody else with the university would know the statistics, but I can just tell you from my experience, I didn't graduate, but my class in the early 80s, those classes, I had one friend who became a teacher. And when I talk to the kids now, graduating from the college, dozens of them going into teaching, social work, other fields like that. And my classmates were not bad people, and some of them eventually did go into other work. But at the time, it was money, Wall Street, etc.
Yeah,
and now I think there's a change.
I mean, I think you represent, I mean, you do a hopeful change. I think there is more. And of course, the feminist movement, let's face it. When I went to law school, class of 200, 3 were women, you know. And today, half the law school is women.
Sure. Yeah.
And more than half, I think, medical.
Medical, more than half.
So
right.
that's, let's face it, that is a big factor.
We have time for a couple more. Yes.
And
I'm sorry.
Before we close,
okay.
I got to tell me on this technological age. But before that,
No. Oh, no. Okay. This lady and then this lady. Okay, yes. Sorry.
I grew up on the far south side of Chicago, and in 60 years, I've seen the city of Chicago evolve into a world-class city. And I think the politics are unique. Who do you think was the mayor in your lifetime that contributed the most to make Chicago what it is today?
This young lady grew up on the far south side of Chicago, and so she's watched for 60 years the changes in the city. She wants to know, who do you think was the mayor in your lifetime who contributed the most to making Chicago?
well, he didn't have too long a term. The mayor, I think Harold Washington. Harold Washington. He was only in for 5 years, but his very election. And remember, and I knew people raised other names, other mayors. There was Carter Harrison, as Daley the Elder, who contributed in 2 ways, you know, 2 ways. But I think that Harold Washington, at first, a great many whites, a good number, you know, hated him, the idea, you know, they couldn't stand it, as you know. But he was doing something. He recognized the others, and in the first year of his second term, he was winning over those who were former things. And he recognized the importance of neighborhoods, not just the loop, but neighborhoods. And a good thing is happening today as far as the Millennium Park is concerned. There's a good piece in the Tribune by John McCarran this morning. That a few of the Britifying is good, and the loop is much better. But there's still the question of neighborhoods. That's the big thing. And I think had he lived another term, would have been. So I would say if there's any one who did, there was a great mayor turn of the century, Carter Harrison, who was very good too. But I want to end this in a certain way. I said I don't accept the 21st century about me and slave. You know, sometimes this hearing problem that I have, like having translated stuff, sometimes it works to my advantage. You see, when our president, George W. Bush, liberated Iraq, remember those 3 days? Mission accomplished, liberated Iraq. All you heard was the phrase embedded journalists. And they were coming through with every Pentagon handout you can name, liberate, embedded. But to my hearing impairment, it comes out with as embed with journalists. But here's the payoff. I have difficult time with the telephone because I want to get a number, and the mechanical voice is answering. I want the human voice. Vox humana. I always loved the human voice as my life, the interviews and all. Here's the mechanical voices. And I asked, but is Charlie there? I wouldn't dare call a guy out of his business. And all I hear is, you want so-and-so, push 1. You want this person, no, push 2. You get the .6. I don't know who the hell it was I called or what I called about. But the payoff, I'll end with this. The payoff came during the early days of the Atlanta airport. New Atlanta airport was a brand new kind of station. And for the first time, they had trains that take you to your destination. You know, you get off the gate. So I get off at the Atlanta gate. I go on those trains, and I'm going to go to Chicago maybe. And so I'm on this train, and I hear a voice. It was once a human voice. Everybody's on that train. They're silent. Not a word is spoken. And they're waiting. The trains are nice and smooth. Up above is a voice. Once a human voice says, Concourse 1, mechanical. Concourse 1, Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston. Concourse 2, imitating a machine. Concourse 3, Concourse 4. Now the door's about to close. So pneumatic door. When a young couple rush in last minute and they part the pneumatic doors, you know, as you do in the elevator about to close, without missing a beat, that voice up above says, because of late entry, we're delayed 1 minute. And everybody's looking at this young couple, probably a honeymoon couple, you know, and they're looking at the couple, and the couple like this, they're like they're at the foot of Calvary on Good Friday, you know. And they're looking at that. Now, I happen to have had a couple of martinis to steal my occasion of this sort, so I call out, train caller's voice, George Orwell, your timer's come and gone. You know, and see, you're laughing, but they did. They looked at me. And suddenly I'm joining the young couple at the foot of Calvary. And I'm going to say, what has happened now to our humor? What's happened to the human voice? Where is the sound? And just there's a little baby on the lap of a mother seated. And she's Hispanic, because she's talking Spanish to her friend. And it's a little baby, about 6 months old. And so I look at the baby. Remember, I have a few drinks. I look at the baby and I say, what is your opinion of the human species? Oh, I held my hand like this because my breath was 100 proof. You know, I mean, what did you? And what did the little baby do? And the baby starts giggling. Thank God, a human voice. There's still hope for the world.